The blade falls at 8 a.m. on May 19th, 1536. Anne Boleyn's head tumbles into the straw, her lips still moving in silent prayer. Blood pools beneath the scaffold as the crowd cheers. They're celebrating the execution of a woman accused of sleeping with 5 different men, including her own brother, while her husband watched through his bedchamber keyhole. But here's the twist that would make Henry VIII roll in his grave. Anne Boleyn, the woman painted as history's ultimate seductress, the femme fatale who destroyed a marriage and split a church, probably had one of the most boring, frustrating, and strategically sexless lives in royal history. Tonight we're diving deep into the brutal, uncomfortable truth behind the propaganda. The real scandal wasn't Anne's appetite for pleasure, it was her complete rejection of it. Her sex life was so calculated, so politically weaponized, so painfully unsexy that it drove the most powerful man in Europe to commit murder. So settle in for the long haul, because we're about to unpack the most successful sexual myth in human history. A myth so convincing, people still believe Anne Boleyn was a nymphomaniac 500 years later, when the truth is far more disturbing. She was just a woman who understood that in Tudor England, your vagina wasn't yours. It belonged to whoever could profit from it. And Anne Boleyn turned that brutal reality into the most effective political weapon of the 16th century. Let's start with the most uncomfortable reality of being born female in 1501. Anne Boleyn enters a world where women's bodies are literally commodities, traded like livestock between men who've never met them. Your worth isn't measured by your intelligence, your character, or your skills. It's measured by the intactness of your hymen and the political connections your father can squeeze out of your uterus. Thomas Boleyn understands this economy better than most. He's a social climber with merchant roots and aristocratic dreams. His strategy is simple: use his daughters' bodies as stepping stones to power. Mary, the elder daughter, will be the practice run. Anne will be the masterpiece. From birth, Anne is being groomed for sexual transaction, but not the kind you're thinking. In Tudor England, there are carefully defined categories of female sexuality, each with its own market value. Category 1, the virgin bride. This is the premium product. Intact hymen, proven bloodline, political connections, and a dowry. Virgin brides become queens, duchesses, and the mothers of legitimate heirs. They have legal rights, social status, and some protection under law. Category 2, the strategic mistress. This is the luxury market. Beautiful, educated, entertaining, but without the bloodline for marriage. Strategic mistresses get titles, pensions, and marriages to minor nobles when they're replaced. They have temporary power, but permanent vulnerability. Category 3, the common whore. This is the disposable market. No protection, no future, no value beyond immediate sexual gratification. Common whores get disease, pregnancy, and death. The system is brutal in its clarity. Move up or die, and the only way to move up is to carefully manage your sexual availability like a precious resource. Anne spends her childhood watching this system in action. At the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, she sees noble girls traded like poker chips in marriage negotiations. In France, serving Queen Claude, she watches how quickly royal mistresses rise and fall based on their ability to maintain male interest, without becoming too available. But it's her sister Mary's destruction that really teaches Anne how the game works. Mary Boleyn becomes Henry VIII's mistress around 1520. She's 19, beautiful, and completely unprepared for what royal sexuality actually means. She thinks she's in love. Henry thinks she's Tuesday's entertainment. The details of Mary's sexual service to the king are precisely what Anne studies, like a doctoral thesis in political failure. Mary is available whenever Henry wants her. She asks for nothing in return except his continued attention. She gets pregnant twice with his bastard children and considers this proof of their special connection. Henry considers it proof that she's useful breeding stock. When Henry gets bored, and he always gets bored, Mary is married off to William Carey, a minor courtier who needs money more than he needs an intact wife. The Boleyn family gets some land grants and court positions out of Mary's sexual service. Mary gets a lifetime of whispered shame and the knowledge that her body was used as currency in her family's social climbing. Anne watches her sister transform from a valuable virgin to discarded breeding mare in the space of 5 years. The lesson is carved into her brain. Give it away cheaply, and you become worthless. Make them pay the ultimate price, and you become invaluable. But Anne takes this lesson further than anyone expects. She doesn't just want to be valuable, she wants to be irreplaceable. And in Tudor England, irreplaceable women are dangerous women. Anne Boleyn returns to the English court after years of European education, and she's nothing like the other ladies in waiting. While they're all trying to catch husbands through flirtation and availability, Anne is studying the sexual economics of power like a master's thesis. She's 25 years old, which in Tudor terms makes her practically geriatric for marriage. Most women her age are either married, dead, or ruined. But Anne has spent those extra years learning something invaluable: how to read men. Not romantically, politically. She understands that powerful men are essentially sexual spoiled children. They want what they can't have, and they lose interest in what they can have. The key is to position yourself permanently in the can't have category, while making them believe that someday, under the right circumstances, they might. When Henry VIII first notices Anne, and we know it's 1526 because he starts writing her letters, she's already refined this strategy through practice. She's had romantic relationships before. Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland, was genuinely in love with her around 1523. They were informally engaged until Cardinal Wolsey broke it up on Henry's orders. The Percy relationship teaches Anne another crucial lesson. Even genuine love can be destroyed by political interference. If she wants to control her own sexual destiny, she needs to aim higher than love. She needs to aim for necessity. So when Henry starts pursuing her, Anne doesn't just play hard to get. She plays impossible to get. But she does it so skillfully that Henry never realises he's being manipulated. Here's how Anne's sexual strategy actually works in practice: physical availability without sexual access. Anne spends hours with Henry, walking in gardens, dining privately, dancing at court functions. She's constantly in his physical presence, but always under circumstances that prevent actual sexual contact. She'll take his hand, but pull away before he can pull her closer. She'll let him help her from a horse, but step away before he can embrace her. She'll sit beside him at dinner, but never close enough for accidental touching. Emotional intimacy without sexual commitment. Anne talks to Henry about politics, religion, and philosophy. She's one of the few people at court who treats him like an intellectual equal rather than just a king. She creates the illusion of deep connection without the vulnerability of physical surrender. Romantic possibility without immediate gratification. Anne never explicitly rejects Henry, but she never explicitly accepts him either. When he begs her to become his mistress, she responds with phrases like, "I would rather lose my life than my honour," which isn't a no, it's a price negotiation. The psychological effect on Henry is devastating. He's never encountered a woman who seems to want him but won't submit to him, who appears to love him but won't prove it, who acts like a queen but won't fuck like a commoner. Henry's love letters from this period reveal a man in complete sexual and emotional confusion. "I beseech you expressly to let me know your whole mind as to the love between us two. Having been now above 1 whole year struck with the dart of love, and being uncertain either of failure or of finding place in your heart and affection." He's literally begging her to tell him if she loves him. The King of England is reduced to teenage-level romantic insecurity by a woman who understands that sexual mystery is more powerful than sexual availability. But Anne's strategy requires perfect execution. One mistake, one moment of weakness, one miscalculated gesture, and she becomes just another royal mistress. The pressure is enormous. She has to maintain Henry's interest without satisfying his desire, create intimacy without vulnerability, and convince him that she's worth destroying his marriage for. And it's working. By 1527, Henry is so sexually and emotionally obsessed with Anne that he's willing to risk everything. His marriage, his international relationships, his standing with the Pope, just for the possibility of possessing her. But possession requires marriage, and marriage requires divorce. And divorce from Catherine of Aragon requires breaking with Rome entirely. Anne Boleyn's boring, strategic, sexually frustrating approach to royal courtship is about to tear English Christianity apart. Let's talk about what 6 years of strategic sexual denial actually looks like when you're living at the most dangerous court in Europe. Because Anne Boleyn doesn't just reject Henry VIII once and disappear into the countryside. She has to maintain this impossible balance, keeping him interested enough to pursue divorce while remaining unavailable enough to maintain her value, while surrounded by people who want her dead. The physical demands of Anne's strategy are exhausting. Every day she has to perform perfect sexual politics. Too available, and she becomes another mistress. Too unavailable, and Henry moves on to someone easier. The daily routine is like elaborate sexual choreography. Anne wakes up knowing that every gesture, every word, every glance will be analysed by Henry and by her enemies for signs of either submission or rejection. She dresses carefully, attractive enough to maintain Henry's interest, modest enough to avoid accusations of impropriety. She attends court functions where she's constantly watched by people looking for evidence of sexual misconduct. During private meetings with Henry, and they have them regularly because political strategy requires access, Anne has to navigate his increasingly desperate sexual advances. Henry isn't just romantically interested. By 1528, he's sexually obsessed. His letters describe physical symptoms of lovesickness, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, inability to concentrate on anything except her body. The uneasiness my heart and I feel is too great, for without you I can neither rejoice nor take rest, he writes. This isn't romantic poetry. It's a description of sexual frustration so severe it's affecting his ability to govern England. And Anne has to manage this carefully. She can't completely reject his advances because that would end the relationship. But she can't accept them either because that would end her leverage. So she develops a repertoire of responses that keep him hoping without satisfying. When Henry tries to kiss her passionately, she'll respond briefly, then pull away, citing propriety. When he tries to touch her body, she'll redirect his hands, while suggesting that such intimacy belongs in marriage. When he begs her to spend the night with him, she'll express her own desire, while explaining why her honour prevents it. This is sexual manipulation at the highest professional level. Anne is essentially giving Henry a constant stream of romantic edging, bringing him to the edge of sexual satisfaction, then pulling back over and over for years. The psychological effect on Henry becomes visible to the entire court. He starts losing weight. His temper becomes unpredictable. He can't focus on political matters because he's constantly thinking about Anne's body. His counsellors start worrying that his sexual obsession is making him unfit to rule. But the effect on Anne is equally dramatic, though she hides it better. The constant sexual performance is emotionally exhausting. She has to appear interested in Henry while actually feeling nothing but calculated political necessity. She has to simulate romantic desire while experiencing only strategic thinking. And the danger is constant. Anne is living in a court where women are routinely executed for much smaller sexual transgressions. Her enemies, and she has many, are constantly looking for evidence that she's actually sleeping with Henry outside of marriage, which would be treason. They're also looking for evidence that she's sleeping with anyone else, which would be adultery and grounds for execution. Every conversation Anne has with any man becomes potential evidence of sexual misconduct. Every private moment becomes fodder for rumour. Every friendship becomes suspect. Meanwhile, the political machinery of Henry's divorce grinds forward with agonising slowness. Catherine of Aragon refuses to accept that her marriage is invalid. The Pope refuses to grant an annulment. The Holy Roman Emperor, Catherine's nephew, threatens war if Henry discards his wife. Anne watches all of this while maintaining her impossible sexual balancing act. Too much pressure on Henry, and he might abandon the divorce as too difficult. Too little pressure, and he might settle for making her his mistress instead of his wife. By 1529, the strain is showing. Anne has angry confrontations with Catherine of Aragon, where years of sexual frustration boil over into political fury. She starts making demands. Henry must banish Catherine from court. He must declare their marriage invalid. He must treat Anne as his true wife, even before the divorce is finalised. These aren't romantic demands, they're political ones. Anne isn't jealous of Catherine as a rival lover. She's furious with Catherine as an obstacle to her own advancement. The sexual tension between Anne and Henry becomes so obvious that foreign ambassadors start reporting on it. The Venetian ambassador writes that Henry is so infatuated with the lady that he cannot do without her for an hour. The French ambassador notes that Anne has complete control over Henry's emotions and decisions, but control based on sexual denial is inherently unstable. Anne knows that every day she refuses Henry is a day closer to him either giving up entirely or finding someone else to satisfy his needs. By 1532, the political situation becomes desperate. Henry has broken with Rome, declared himself head of the English Church, and begun dismantling the Catholic power structure. But he still can't legally marry Anne while Catherine is alive and refusing to accept divorce. So Henry and Anne make a decision that will change everything. They'll marry in secret and hope the political situation catches up to their personal desires. On November 14th, 1532, after 6 years of strategic sexual denial, Anne Boleyn finally has sex with Henry VIII, and immediately discovers that giving him what he wanted was the beginning of her problems, not the end of them. November 14th, 1532. Somewhere between Dover and Calais, in a hastily arranged ceremony, with a terrified priest and no legal witnesses, Anne Boleyn becomes Henry VIII's secret wife, after 6 years of the most calculated sexual denial in political history. She's about to lose her virginity to a man whose previous marriage hasn't been legally dissolved. The details of Anne's wedding night reveal just how unsexy royal politics really are. She's 31 years old, which in Tudor medical understanding makes her practically geriatric for first pregnancy. She's been secretly married to a man whose first wife is still alive and claiming to be his true queen. And she's about to become the most hated woman in England. The location is probably Dover Castle, chosen because it's close to the French border in case they need to flee quickly. The ceremony is performed by a priest who's been either bribed or threatened into conducting an illegal marriage. There are no witnesses except possibly Thomas Cranmer, who would later become Archbishop of Canterbury, partly to legitimise what happens this night. The sexual encounter itself is almost certainly disappointing for both parties. Henry is 41 years old, significantly overweight, and suffering from what historians believe was either diabetes or a leg ulcer that causes him constant pain. He's also sexually inexperienced with virgins. All his previous partners have been either his wife Catherine or experienced mistresses. Anne is a 31-year-old virgin who has spent 6 years building up this sexual encounter as the culmination of her entire political strategy. The pressure to perform, not sexually but reproductively, is enormous. Every month she doesn't conceive will be seen as evidence that God disapproves of their marriage. And then there's the physical reality of Tudor sexuality. No understanding of female anatomy means no concept of foreplay or sexual pleasure for women. No understanding of hygiene means high risk of infection. No effective contraception means every sexual encounter could result in pregnancy or death. Royal sex in the 16th century isn't about pleasure or even love. It's about political necessity disguised as marital duty. But Anne performs perfectly. She gets pregnant almost immediately, probably on their first or second sexual encounter. After 6 years of strategic virginity, her body delivers exactly what the political situation requires. The problem is what she delivers. January 25th, 1533. Henry and Anne go through another marriage ceremony. This one slightly more official, but still secret. Anne is already pregnant, but nobody knows the gender of the child. Everything. Henry's break with Rome, the destruction of English Catholicism, Anne's own survival, depends on her producing a male heir. The pressure during Anne's pregnancy is unbearable. Every day she doesn't miscarry is a victory. Every sign of morning sickness is celebrated as proof that the pregnancy is healthy. Every movement from the baby is analysed for evidence of masculine vigour. Meanwhile, the political situation deteriorates rapidly. Catherine of Aragon refuses to accept that her marriage is invalid. The Pope excommunicates Henry. The Holy Roman Emperor threatens invasion. English Catholics begin plotting rebellion. All of this depends on Anne's uterus producing the right chromosome combination. September 7th, 1533. After 9 months of political pregnancy, Anne gives birth to Elizabeth Tudor. The baby is healthy, beautiful, and politically disastrous. Henry, who has spent 7 years restructuring English society for the promise of a male heir, takes one look at his daughter and walks out of the room without saying a word. Anne has just discovered the brutal mathematics of royal marriage. All her sexual strategy, all her political manoeuvring, all her years of careful calculation mean nothing if her body can't produce a son. And from this moment forward, Anne's sex life becomes a desperate medical experiment designed to correct her reproductive failure. From September 1533 to May 1536, Anne Boleyn's marriage becomes a horror show of medieval obstetrics and political desperation. Every sexual encounter with Henry carries the weight of English foreign policy. Every menstrual cycle is a political crisis. Every failed pregnancy brings her closer to divorce, exile, or execution. The brutal details of Tudor reproductive medicine reveal just how little anyone understood about female biology. Doctors believe that women's wombs wander around their bodies, causing hysteria. They think that strong emotions during pregnancy can mark the baby with physical deformities. They're convinced that the position during conception determines the child's gender. Anne becomes a laboratory rat for these medical theories. Court physicians monitor her menstrual cycles, analyse her urine for signs of pregnancy, and prescribe increasingly bizarre treatments to help her conceive sons. The sexual dynamic between Anne and Henry during this period is purely transactional. He needs her to produce a male heir. She needs to stay pregnant to stay alive. Romance is irrelevant. Pleasure is counterproductive. Every sexual encounter is a business transaction disguised as marital duty. And Henry's sexual technique, if we can call it that, is probably terrible. He's middle-aged, overweight, and increasingly disabled by what appears to be a chronic leg infection. He's never needed to worry about female satisfaction because royal wives don't get to complain about their husband's sexual performance. The pressure to conceive quickly means Anne and Henry have sex frequently during her fertile periods, probably multiple times per day when court physicians determine she's ovulating. This isn't passion. It's mechanical breeding designed to maximise conception chances. 1534, Anne gets pregnant again. The entire court holds its breath for 9 months. Then around the 4th month, she miscarries. The lost baby is probably male, which makes the failure even more devastating. The miscarriage is attributed to Anne's emotional instability, her arguments with Henry, her conflicts with court officials, her unwomanly involvement in political affairs. The message is clear. If Anne was a better wife, she would be a better breeding machine. 1535, pregnant again. This time, Anne is confined to bed rest for months, forbidden from any activity that might disturb the pregnancy. She's essentially imprisoned in her own chambers, while doctors monitor her every bodily function. Another miscarriage, this one around the 5th month. Again probably male. Again blamed on Anne's unnatural behaviour and God's displeasure with her marriage. Each reproductive failure makes Henry more distant, more critical, more obviously disappointed. The man who once wrote passionate love letters now treats Anne like defective machinery that needs to be repaired or replaced. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. Anne understands exactly what's happening to her. She's lived through this pattern before, watching Catherine of Aragon's gradual replacement after years of failed pregnancies. Anne knows that royal wives are disposed of when they stop being reproductively useful. The sexual relationship between Anne and Henry becomes increasingly desperate and mechanical. She's trying to get pregnant to save her life. He's trying to impregnate her to justify his political decisions. Neither of them is experiencing anything resembling pleasure or intimacy. By late 1535, Henry's already looking for Anne's replacement. He starts an affair with Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. The message is unmistakable. Anne has failed as a wife, and Henry is shopping for a more productive breeding partner. But unlike Catherine of Aragon, who accepted her divorce gracefully, Anne fights back. She confronts Henry about his infidelity. She demands respect as his legal wife. She refuses to be quietly discarded like yesterday's garbage. This is her fatal mistake, because Henry VIII has discovered that divorce is messy, expensive, and politically damaging. Execution, on the other hand, is quick, final, and allows him to remarry immediately. All he needs is a reason to kill her. And in Tudor England, the easiest way to execute a woman is to accuse her of sexual crimes. April 1536. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's new chief minister, has been given an impossible task: find legal grounds to execute a queen who has committed no crime except failing to produce a son. The solution he devises is a masterpiece of sexual character assassination so effective that people still believe it 500 years later. Cromwell understands something crucial about Tudor society. People want to believe that powerful women are sexually corrupt. It confirms their prejudices about female ambition and makes male authority seem natural and necessary. So Cromwell doesn't need to prove that Anne committed adultery. He just needs to create a narrative that makes adultery seem inevitable, given her character, her behaviour, and her relationships with men. The method is brilliantly systematic. First, Cromwell identifies every man Anne has ever had any relationship with, romantic, political, or professional. Then he reframes each relationship as evidence of sexual intimacy. Finally, he extracts confessions through torture and presents them as proof of a vast conspiracy of adultery. Target 1. Mark Smeaton, court musician. Smeaton is the easiest target because he's low-born and has no powerful family to protect him. Cromwell has him arrested and tortured until he confesses to having sexual relations with the Queen. The confession is obviously coerced. Smeaton is missing several fingers by the time he signs it, and witnesses report seeing him dragged to his cell, unconscious and bleeding. But the confession serves its purpose. It establishes that Anne is sexually available to men beneath her social station. The evidence against Smeaton is pathetically thin. He once played music at a court function where Anne was present. He received payment for his services, which Cromwell reframes as payment for sexual services. Anne once complimented his musical abilities, which becomes evidence of intimate familiarity. But it doesn't matter how flimsy the evidence is. Once Smeaton confesses under torture, he becomes the foundation for accusing everyone else. Target 2. Henry Norris, groom of the stool. Norris is Henry's closest personal servant, responsible for his most intimate daily needs. Attacking Norris sends a message that Anne's sexual corruption has penetrated Henry's inner circle. The evidence against Norris is even more ridiculous. Anne once joked with him about marriage, saying that if anything happened to Henry, Norris would look to have me. In context, this was clearly political banter about succession and remarriage. Cromwell presents it as evidence of a sexual relationship and succession conspiracy. Norris refuses to confess even under torture. He maintains his innocence until his execution, which should be evidence of his genuine innocence. Instead, Cromwell argues that his refusal to confess proves how deeply he's committed to protecting Anne's honour. Target 3. William Brereton, Gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Brereton is targeted because he's politically dangerous. He has connections to Welsh nobility who might support Anne against Henry. His alleged sexual relationship with Anne becomes grounds for treason charges. The evidence? Brereton once carried messages between Anne and Henry during their courtship. He attended court functions where Anne was present. He received court appointments that Anne may have supported. All of this normal court behaviour is reframed as evidence of secret sexual communication and intimate personal relationship. Target 4. Francis Weston, Gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Weston is young, handsome, and married to a very young wife. Anne once criticised his marriage, suggesting he was too young for the responsibilities of marriage. Cromwell presents this as evidence of sexual jealousy. Anne was supposedly upset that Weston was sexually unavailable to her. The accusation is absurd. Anne was criticising Weston's marriage because she thought teenage marriage was inappropriate, not because she wanted to sleep with him. But in Cromwell's narrative, any interest Anne shows in any man becomes evidence of sexual desire. Target 5. George Boleyn, Anne's brother. This is Cromwell's masterstroke. Accusing Anne of incest with her own brother serves multiple purposes. It suggests that her sexual corruption is so complete that even family bonds can't contain it. It eliminates a powerful political supporter, and it creates a crime so shocking that execution becomes not just justified, but necessary. The evidence for incest is non-existent. George and Anne spent time together discussing politics and religion, normal sibling behaviour among educated nobles. They corresponded about political matters, normal behaviour for family members at court. Anne sometimes defended George against criticism, normal behaviour for a sister. But Cromwell argues that their intellectual intimacy must have led to sexual intimacy. The fact that they shared interests and ideas becomes evidence that they shared bodies. The incest charge is particularly effective because it can't be disproven. How do you prove you didn't have sex with your brother? How do you demonstrate that private conversations were political rather than sexual? How do you defend yourself against accusations that any demonstration of affection becomes evidence of perversion? May 15th, 1536. Anne Boleyn stands trial for adultery, incest and treason in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. The outcome is predetermined, the evidence is fabricated, and the process is a legal farce. But but the trial itself reveals something fascinating about how sexual reputation operates in political systems. The prosecution's case is essentially this: Anne Boleyn is the kind of woman who would commit adultery, therefore she must have committed adultery. The evidence isn't about what she did, it's about who she is. Let's examine how every aspect of Anne's character and behaviour is reinterpreted as evidence of sexual corruption. Anne is well educated, speaks multiple languages, and engages in political and religious discussions. In most contexts, this would be admirable. But Cromwell argues that intelligent women use their minds to manipulate men sexually. Anne's ability to discuss theology becomes evidence that she used religious conversations to seduce court chaplains. Her political knowledge becomes proof that she exchanged sexual favours for political information. Her linguistic skills become evidence that she conducted affairs in foreign languages to avoid detection. Anne has opinions, expresses them publicly, and sometimes argues with Henry. Again, this could be seen as admirable strength of character, but the prosecution presents it as evidence of sexual insubordination. A woman who argues with her husband is a woman who doesn't respect male authority. A woman who doesn't respect male authority is a woman who might ignore sexual boundaries. A woman who ignores sexual boundaries is a woman who commits adultery. Anne's romantic history, her relationship with Henry Percy, her possible involvement with Thomas Wyatt, is presented as evidence of a pattern of sexual manipulation. The fact that she had romantic relationships before marriage becomes proof that she continued having them after marriage. Never mind that Percy was a legitimate courtship broken up by political interference, or that Wyatt's interest in Anne was probably unrequited and expressed through poetry rather than physical relationship. In Cromwell's narrative, any evidence that men found Anne attractive becomes evidence that she used that attraction for sexual purposes. This is particularly cruel. Anne's reproductive failures, which were probably caused by stress, poor medical care, and random biological factors, are presented as evidence that God disapproves of her sexual behaviour. If Anne was a faithful wife, the argument goes, God would bless her marriage with sons. Since she produces daughters and miscarriages, she must be committing sexual sins that anger the divine. Anne's natural reactions to the accusations, anger, fear, desperation, are interpreted as evidence of guilt. An innocent woman would remain calm and dignified. Anne's emotional responses prove that she has something to hide. This creates an impossible situation. Any reaction Anne has to being accused of sexual crimes becomes evidence that she committed sexual crimes. The trial itself is a masterclass in legal theatre. The jury consists of nobles who have already decided Anne's fate based on political necessity rather than evidence. The witnesses are men who have been tortured into confession or who have political reasons to support Henry's decision. Anne's defence is heartbreaking in its simplicity. She's innocent. She loved Henry. She never betrayed him. She's a good Christian woman who tried to be a good wife and queen. But innocence isn't a defence against character assassination. The prosecution doesn't need to prove that Anne committed specific sexual acts at specific times. They just need to prove that she's the kind of woman who would commit those acts. And in Tudor England, any woman with intelligence, ambition, and independence is automatically that kind of woman. The verdict is guilty on all charges. The sentence is death by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Henry chooses beheading. Even in arranging her execution, he's concerned with maintaining the illusion that he's a merciful husband, rather than a political murderer. May 19th, 1536, 8 a.m. Tower Green. Anne Boleyn is about to die for sexual crimes she never committed, executed by a husband who spent 6 years begging for the sexual favours he now claims were distributed freely to other men. The staging of Anne's execution is itself a piece of sexual theatre, designed to transform her from a political threat into a penitent sinner seeking redemption through death. Every detail of her appearance is carefully controlled. She's dressed in grey damask, the colour of mourning and penitence, rather than the rich fabrics and jewel tones she favoured in life. Her hair is completely hidden under a white coif, removing one of her most distinctive physical features. She wears no jewellery except a small crucifix, emphasising her spiritual rather than worldly concerns. The costume transforms Anne from a sexual being into a religious penitent. She's no longer the woman who allegedly seduced 5 men simultaneously. She's a sinner seeking divine forgiveness. The crowd gathered to watch her execution is mostly male and mostly hostile. They've been fed a steady diet of propaganda about Anne's sexual crimes for weeks. Many genuinely believe she's an adulteress who deserves death. Others simply enjoy the spectacle of watching a powerful woman destroyed. Anne's final speech is a masterpiece of political calculation, even in death. She says, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the King, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world, and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." This speech is brilliant in its restraint. Anne doesn't proclaim her innocence. That would be treason, since it would contradict the legal judgment against her. She doesn't attack Henry. That would endanger Elizabeth's future position. She doesn't even defend her sexual reputation. Instead, she performs the role of the penitent adulteress, while carefully avoiding any actual admission of guilt. She asks people to judge the best about her case, implying that there might be room for different interpretations of the evidence. The execution itself is handled by a French executioner imported specifically for the occasion. Henry has commissioned a sharp sword, rather than using the traditional English axe, supposedly as a mercy to Anne. In reality, the foreign executioner and foreign weapon help distance Henry from the act of killing his wife. The executioner approaches from behind, while Anne is kneeling in prayer, her eyes covered. She doesn't see the blow coming. Her head is severed with one clean stroke and falls into the straw, prepared to catch it. The crowd cheers. Anne Boleyn, the woman who weaponized her virginity to break the Catholic Church's hold on England, dies branded as a whore. But even in death, Anne's sexual reputation continues to evolve. Within hours of her execution, rumours begin spreading that she died nobly, that she was innocent, that Henry killed her in a fit of jealous passion rather than for legitimate legal reasons. The woman who spent her life carefully managing her sexual reputation becomes in death a romantic martyr. The boring reality of her strategic approach to sexuality transforms into a legend of passionate destruction. Within 24 hours of Anne Boleyn's execution, the mythology begins. Courtiers whisper that she died with dignity. Foreign ambassadors report that she maintained her innocence to the end. Popular ballads start circulating that present her as a tragic figure destroyed by love, rather than a criminal destroyed by justice. The transformation of Anne from executed adulteress to romantic heroine serves everyone's purposes. For her supporters, it allows them to maintain that she was innocent without directly challenging Henry's authority. For her enemies, it confirms that she was dangerous enough to require execution. For Henry himself, it transforms political murder into romantic tragedy. But the most important audience for Anne's evolving sexual mythology is her daughter Elizabeth. By the time Elizabeth becomes queen in 1558, the story of Anne Boleyn has already undergone significant revision. Elizabeth needs her mother to be respectable enough to legitimise her own rule, but not so saintly as to make Henry look like a murderer. The solution is to present Anne as a passionate woman who made tragic mistakes, neither innocent victim nor calculating seductress, but a figure of romantic excess who paid the ultimate price for love. This narrative becomes the foundation for centuries of Anne Boleyn mythology. She's the woman who loved too much, who risked everything for passion, who destroyed herself through sexual indiscretion. It's a compelling story. It's also almost completely false. Let's compare the mythology to what actually happened. Myth. Anne Boleyn was a passionate seductress who used her sexuality to manipulate Henry VIII. Reality. Anne Boleyn was a strategic politician who used sexual denial to control Henry VIII for 6 years, then had mechanical reproductive sex for 3 years before being executed on fabricated adultery charges. Myth. Anne's great love affair with Henry destroyed their marriage and led to her death. Reality. Anne had no love affair with Henry. She had a political alliance that she maintained through sexual unavailability until it became politically inconvenient for Henry to keep her alive. Myth. Anne's sexual appetite was so excessive that she committed adultery with multiple men, including her own brother. Reality. Anne probably had sex with exactly one man, Henry, for exactly 3 years, and spent the rest of her adult life as a strategic virgin or a desperate wife trying to conceive sons. Myth. Anne's execution was the tragic end of a great romantic passion. Reality. Anne's execution was a political assassination designed to allow Henry to remarry without the complications of divorce. The boring truth about Anne Boleyn's sex life is that she barely had one. She spent 6 years not having sex as a political strategy, 3 years having bad sex as a royal duty, and 0 years enjoying sex as a personal pleasure. To understand just how unsexy Anne Boleyn's sexual strategy really was, we need to examine the brutal economics of female sexuality in Tudor England. Women's bodies weren't their own. They were commodities in a political marketplace where men traded access to wombs, hymens and bloodlines like stocks and bonds. In Tudor England, virginity isn't a personal choice, it's a family asset. A intact hymen represents political possibility, the chance for a family to trade their daughter's sexuality for advancement, titles, land, or international alliances. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, understands this market better than most. He invests in Anne's virginity like a long-term financial strategy. Every year she remains unmarried is a year her value potentially increases, as long as she doesn't get damaged goods by actually having sex. But virginity also depreciates with age. A 16-year-old virgin is premium merchandise. A 25-year-old virgin is getting close to clearance pricing. By the time Anne is 31 and finally loses her virginity to Henry, she's basically past her sell-by date in the royal marriage market. Anne's sexual strategy works only because she's targeting the one man in England who can't simply buy a younger, more fertile replacement. Henry needs Anne specifically because she represents something no other woman can offer: the possibility of a male heir from a fresh bloodline without the political complications of international marriage. Once Anne marries Henry, her sexuality becomes a matter of national security. Every menstrual cycle is monitored by court physicians. Every sexual encounter is timed to maximise conception chances. Every pregnancy becomes a political event that affects international relations. Anne's reproductive capacity isn't her own, it belongs to the English state. When she fails to produce sons, she's not just disappointing her husband, she's failing in her primary duty as queen. The medical understanding of female reproduction in the 1530s is both primitive and politically loaded. Doctors believe that women who are too intellectual, too emotional, or too politically active can't conceive properly. Anne's involvement in religious and political affairs is literally seen as damaging to her fertility. So Anne is caught in an impossible bind. She needs to be intelligent and politically savvy enough to maintain her position as queen. But any demonstration of those qualities is used as evidence that she's failing at her biological function. Royal women in Tudor England face a sexual catch-22 that's designed to destroy them no matter what they do. If you're sexually available before marriage, you're a whore who can't be trusted. If you're sexually unavailable before marriage, you're suspicious and probably hiding something. If you're sexually enthusiastic after marriage, you're lustful and might be unfaithful. If you're sexually restrained after marriage, you're frigid and probably not producing heirs because you don't enjoy sex enough. If you produce children quickly, you're overly fertile and might be having affairs. If you don't produce children quickly, you're barren and useless. If you produce daughters, you're failing at your primary function. If you produce sons who don't survive, you're being punished by God for sexual sins. Anne navigates this impossible system better than most, but ultimately, no woman can win a game where the rules are designed to justify whatever punishment men want to inflict. The genius of using sexual accusations to destroy Anne Boleyn is that they can't be definitively disproven. How do you prove you didn't have sex with someone? How do you demonstrate that private conversations were innocent? How do you defend yourself against accusations where any evidence of male friendship becomes proof of sexual misconduct? Sexual accusations are also more emotionally powerful than political ones. Calling Anne a traitor or a heretic requires complex arguments about loyalty and religion. Calling her an adulteress requires only the assumption that women with power are probably sexually corrupt. The sexual charges against Anne work because they tap into existing anxieties about female sexuality and political authority. In a world where women aren't supposed to have independent political power, any woman who achieves it must have used sexual manipulation to get there. Let's talk about what Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII actually looked like, day to day, because it wasn't the passionate love affair of legend. It was a business partnership with mandatory sexual performance, and it was probably miserable for everyone involved. By 1533, Henry VIII is 42 years old, significantly overweight and suffering from what historians believe was either diabetes, a chronic leg ulcer, or both. He's not the athletic young king who once impressed European courts with his physical prowess. He's a middle-aged man with serious health problems and an increasingly erratic temper. His daily routine revolves around managing his medical conditions and his political crises. He requires extensive personal care, help dressing, help walking, constant medical attention. His leg wound, which may have been a recurring ulcer, produces a smell that courtiers describe as nauseating. This is the man Anne has to sleep with regularly in hopes of producing sons. The sexual encounters between Anne and Henry during their marriage are probably brief, uncomfortable, and focused entirely on conception rather than pleasure. Tudor medical theory holds that female orgasm is necessary for conception, but the methods recommended for achieving it are crude and mechanical. Court physicians probably monitor Anne's menstrual cycles and instruct Henry when to have sex with her for maximum fertility. This isn't romance, it's scheduled breeding designed to produce male heirs as efficiently as possible. Every time Anne gets pregnant, it becomes a matter of international politics. Foreign ambassadors report on her morning sickness, her appetite, her emotional state. Court physicians analyse her urine, monitor her diet, and restrict her activities to prevent miscarriage. Anne essentially loses all personal autonomy during pregnancy. She can't travel, can't engage in political activities, can't even choose her own food without medical supervision. She becomes a walking incubator whose only value is the potential son in her womb. The psychological pressure is enormous. Anne knows that every pregnancy could be her last chance to prove her worth as a wife. Every bout of morning sickness is scrutinised for signs of whether the baby might be male. Every movement from the fetus is analysed by people who have never studied anatomy but claim to be able to predict gender based on how the baby kicks. When Anne miscarries, it's not just a personal tragedy, it's a political disaster that affects England's foreign policy and her own survival as queen. Sex between Anne and Henry during their marriage is probably as unsexy as sex can possibly be. It's scheduled around her fertility cycles, performed under medical supervision, and evaluated based entirely on whether it results in male pregnancy. Henry's sexual technique is probably terrible. He's been married to Catherine of Aragon for 24 years, during which time she never complained about his sexual performance, because royal wives don't get to complain about anything. He's had mistresses, but they were focused on maintaining his interest rather than achieving their own satisfaction. Anne, meanwhile, has no sexual experience except her 3 years with Henry. She has no basis for comparison and no expectation that sex should be pleasurable for her. Her job is to conceive, not to enjoy herself. The result is probably a series of brief, awkward sexual encounters focused entirely on male orgasm and female conception. Anne endures it because she has to. Henry performs it because he needs a son. Neither of them is having what anyone would recognise as a satisfying sexual relationship. Despite the private reality of their relationship, Anne and Henry have to perform marital happiness in public. They attend court functions together, dance together, and appear to be a loving royal couple. This performance becomes increasingly difficult as their marriage deteriorates. By 1535, they're arguing publicly about Henry's affair with Jane Seymour. Anne is demanding fidelity, while Henry is openly shopping for her replacement. But even their arguments have to be carefully managed. Anne can't appear too independent or too controlling, because that would justify Henry's decision to replace her. Henry can't appear too cruel or too arbitrary, because that would undermine the legitimacy of their marriage and their daughter Elizabeth's claim to the throne. So they perform a carefully choreographed dance of marital dysfunction, where every gesture is calculated for political effect rather than emotional honesty. Thomas Cromwell's destruction of Anne Boleyn creates the template for sexual character assassination that's still used today. The techniques he develops in 1536 become the standard playbook for destroying powerful women through sexual accusation. Step 1. Reframe independence as sexual availability. Any sign that a woman thinks for herself becomes evidence that she's sexually uncontrolled. Anne's education becomes proof that she used her intelligence to seduce men. Her political opinions become evidence that she traded sexual favours for political information. Her arguments with Henry become proof that she doesn't respect male authority, and therefore doesn't respect sexual boundaries. This technique is brilliant because it makes female competence itself suspicious. The more capable a woman is, the more likely she must be using sexual manipulation to achieve her goals. Step 2. Turn male attraction into female corruption. Any evidence that men found Anne attractive becomes proof that she encouraged and exploited that attraction. The fact that Henry Percy wanted to marry her becomes evidence that she seduced him. Thomas Wyatt's poetry about her becomes proof that she had an affair with him. Even Henry's own obsession with her becomes evidence of her manipulative sexual power rather than his emotional instability. This technique is particularly effective because it makes women responsible for male behaviour. If a man is attracted to a woman, it must be because she deliberately made herself attractive. If a man pursues a woman, it must be because she encouraged him. Step 3. Criminalise female relationships. Every friendship Anne has with any man becomes potential evidence of sexual misconduct. Her conversations with court musicians become proof of affairs with servants. Her political discussions with male courtiers become evidence of sexual relationships. Even her relationship with her own brother becomes evidence of incest. This technique isolates women from male allies and makes it impossible for them to build political coalitions. Any man who supports a woman becomes suspect of sexual involvement with her. Step 4. Use medical failure as moral evidence. Anne's miscarriages become proof that God disapproves of her sexual behaviour. Her failure to produce sons becomes evidence that she's being punished for adultery. Even her physical appearance, the fact that she's not conventionally beautiful by Tudor standards, becomes evidence that she must have used supernatural seduction to attract men. This technique is particularly cruel because it turns biological bad luck into moral judgment. Women are held responsible, not just for their own actions, but for random medical events beyond their control. Step 5. Make denial look like guilt. Any attempt Anne makes to defend herself becomes evidence of her guilt. If she remains calm, she's cold and calculating. If she becomes emotional, she's hysterical and unstable. If she proclaims her innocence, she's lying. If she admits fault, she's confirming the accusations. This creates an impossible situation where any response to sexual accusations becomes proof that the accusations are justified. These techniques are so effective that they survive Anne Boleyn by centuries. The same playbook used to destroy her in 1536 is still being used to destroy powerful women today. Anne Boleyn dies on May 19, 1536, but her sexual reputation lives on. Over the next 500 years, her story becomes the foundation for countless myths about female sexuality, political power, and the supposed dangers of ambitious women. Within a generation of her death, Anne is transformed from executed traitor to legendary seductress. She becomes the woman who was so sexually powerful that she destroyed a 1,000-year-old religious tradition. Writers and historians emphasize her supposed sexual magnetism while ignoring her political sophistication. This myth serves multiple purposes. For Henry's supporters, it justifies his decision to break with Rome. He was seduced by an irresistible woman and can't be blamed for his actions. For religious conservatives, it proves that Protestantism was founded on lust rather than legitimate theological concerns. For misogynists of every era, it confirms that women who achieve political power must have used sexual manipulation to get there. Starting in the 20th century, Anne is reclaimed as a feminist icon who used her sexuality as a weapon against patriarchal authority. This version of Anne is sexually liberated, politically savvy, and unashamed of her desires. While this interpretation is more sympathetic than the seductress myth, it's equally divorced from historical reality. Anne wasn't sexually liberated, she was sexually strategic. She didn't celebrate female sexuality, she weaponized sexual denial. She didn't challenge patriarchal authority, she learned to manipulate it for her own survival. Popular culture consistently presents Anne as a woman destroyed by love. She becomes the tragic heroine who risked everything for passion and paid the ultimate price for following her heart. This romantic interpretation completely misses the point of Anne's actual story. She wasn't destroyed by love, she was destroyed by politics. She didn't follow her heart, she followed a carefully calculated strategy for political advancement. She didn't die for passion, she died because she failed to produce a male heir and became politically inconvenient. These myths about Anne Boleyn's sexuality have real consequences for how we understand history and politics. They reinforce the idea that women's political achievements must be based on sexual manipulation rather than intellectual capability. They suggest that female power is inherently unstable and dangerous. They turn a story about political murder into a cautionary tale about female ambition. Most importantly, they obscure the real lesson of Anne Boleyn's life, that in a system designed to destroy ambitious women, even perfect execution of survival strategies isn't enough to guarantee survival. Anne played the game better than anyone else of her generation. She understood the rules, exploited the system's weaknesses, and achieved more political power than any English woman before her, and the system still killed her when she became inconvenient. If we strip away 500 years of sexual mythology and look at what Anne Boleyn actually did with her body and her sexuality, we learn some uncomfortable truths about power, politics, and the price of female ambition. Anne Boleyn is often presented as either a victim of male sexuality or a woman who used her sexuality for personal empowerment. But her actual story reveals a third category: a woman who used sexual strategy for political survival. Anne's approach to sexuality wasn't about personal fulfillment or romantic satisfaction. It was about navigating a system where female political participation was only possible through sexual negotiation. She turned her body into a political weapon, not because she wanted to, but because it was the only weapon the system allowed her to have. This distinction matters because it reveals how limited women's options really were in Tudor England. Anne couldn't achieve political power through merit, education, or capability. Those paths weren't available to women. She could only achieve power by carefully managing male access to her sexuality. Anne's destruction reveals that in systems designed to exclude women from power, even perfect execution of survival strategies isn't enough to guarantee survival. Anne did everything right, according to the rules of Tudor sexual politics, and the system still killed her when she became inconvenient. She preserved her virginity until she could trade it for marriage. She used sexual denial to control the most powerful man in Europe. She achieved the highest political position available to women. She tried to fulfill her reproductive duties as efficiently as possible, and none of it mattered when Henry decided he wanted a new wife. This suggests that women's political advancement in patriarchal systems is always conditional and reversible. No matter how well women play the game, the rules can be changed whenever their success becomes threatening to male authority. The techniques Thomas Cromwell used to destroy Anne Boleyn are still being used to destroy powerful women today. Female politicians, business leaders, and public figures still face sexual accusations designed to undermine their professional competence. Their relationships are still scrutinized for evidence of impropriety. Their personal lives are still used as weapons against their public achievements. Anne's story demonstrates how effective sexual character assassination can be, and how difficult it is to defend against. Once sexual accusations are made, they become the dominant narrative, regardless of their truth or relevance to a woman's professional capabilities. The persistent myths about Anne Boleyn's sexuality prevent us from learning the real lessons of her story. When we focus on her supposed seductive powers, we miss her political brilliance. When we romanticize her relationship with Henry, we ignore the brutal calculations that actually governed their interactions. When we turn her into a sexual icon, we lose sight of her as a political innovator. These myths also make it harder for contemporary women to understand the full range of strategies available to them. Anne's actual approach to sexuality, strategic, calculated, focused on long-term political goals rather than short-term pleasure, might be more useful to study than the romantic myths that have replaced it. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Anne Boleyn's story is how little sexual agency she actually had throughout her life. For a woman remembered primarily for her sexuality, Anne spent remarkably little time actually experiencing sexual pleasure, choice, or freedom. From birth, Anne's sexuality belongs to her father's political ambitions. She's educated not for her own intellectual development, but to make her more valuable in the marriage market. She learns languages, music, and court etiquette because these skills make her more attractive to potential husbands and their families. Her childhood in European courts exposes her to the brutal realities of sexual politics but gives her no opportunity to develop her own sexual desires or preferences. She watches women rise and fall based on their ability to manage male attention, but she's never allowed to explore what she might want for herself. Anne's 20s are spent in carefully calculated sexual denial. Every interaction with men is evaluated for political consequences rather than personal satisfaction. She can't afford to develop genuine romantic feelings because emotions would compromise her strategic thinking. The relationship with Henry Percy, which might have been her only opportunity for genuine romantic love, is destroyed by political interference. After that, Anne seems to abandon the possibility of emotional satisfaction and focus entirely on political advancement. Anne's 3 years of marriage to Henry involved mechanical, politically necessary sex, focused entirely on conception rather than pleasure. She has no privacy, no autonomy, and no opportunity to develop her own sexual preferences. Every sexual encounter is monitored by court physicians and evaluated based on whether it might produce a male heir. Anne's pleasure is irrelevant except insofar as Tudor medical theory suggests that female orgasm might be necessary for conception. Throughout her entire adult life, Anne Boleyn never gets to experience sexuality as personal choice rather than political necessity. She never gets to explore her own desires, develop intimate relationships based on mutual attraction, or simply enjoy physical pleasure without calculating the political consequences. For a woman who supposedly used her sexuality to change the course of English history, Anne was remarkably sexually constrained. Her body was never really hers. It belonged to her father's ambitions, then Henry's obsessions, then the political requirements of royal succession. The irony is that Anne might have been happier and lived longer if she had been less sexually strategic. If she had slept with Henry when he first pursued her, she would have become his mistress, been discarded after a few years, and probably lived quietly as the wife of some minor nobleman. But Anne wanted more than sexual security. She wanted political power. And in Tudor England, the price of political power for women was the complete surrender of sexual autonomy. So what was Anne Boleyn's sex life really like? Boring, strategic, calculated, politically necessary, and ultimately completely unsuccessful at protecting her from the system she learned to manipulate. Anne spent 6 years not having sex as a political strategy. She spent 3 years having bad sex as a royal duty. She spent 0 years enjoying sex as a personal pleasure. And she died accused of having so much sex that execution was the only way to contain her dangerous sexuality. Her story isn't a cautionary tale about female sexual excess. It's a case study in how patriarchal systems use sexual accusation to destroy women who become too powerful, regardless of their actual sexual behaviour. Anne Boleyn's sexual strategy was probably the most successful in political history. She used strategic virginity to control a king, break a religious tradition, and change the course of English history. She turned sexual denial into the most effective political weapon of the 16th century. And it still wasn't enough to save her. The real horror of Anne Boleyn's sex life isn't what she did with her sexuality, it's what was done to her because of it. She lived in a world where women's political worth was inseparable from their sexual reputation, where female ambition was automatically suspect, and where sexual accusations were the preferred method for destroying women who became inconvenient. 500 years later, we're still telling her story wrong. We're still focusing on the sexual mythology rather than the political reality. We're still missing the point. Anne Boleyn wasn't destroyed by her sexuality. She was destroyed by a system that turned female sexuality into a weapon against women themselves. Her sex life wasn't horrific or scandalous or exciting. It was just the price she had to pay for being the smartest, most politically sophisticated person in Tudor England. And in a world designed to punish female intelligence, that was always going to be a death sentence. The most boring sex life in royal history changed everything, and then it killed her.